All right, guys, so I know it's been a while since I've made any sort of like restoration or technical-esque video, and today I've got a really interesting project that I've been working on, an idea I had, and this idea kind of spurred out of an issue I've been having for a long time. In fact, it's an issue I've been having since before my show was ever even done, and it's an issue that plagued showbiz pizza places across the United States, including, I'm actually, later in this video, you guys are gonna get introduced to a technician who worked, ironically, at the St. Joseph, Missouri Showbiz Pizza from 1984 to 1987. And he said that he had nothing but issues with the curtain motors. In fact, he was saying that they were replacing the motors monthly. In particular, I've had relays fail, I've had start capacitors fail, I've had the motors rip themselves up off the floor. I've had nothing but issues. And everybody I hear talk about it, whether it's the tech or Aaron or other people, everyone seems to have had issues with these curtain motors. And so I was wondering what mechanism could I use or what system could I use to replace the curtain motors? And that's when I started thinking about the sun and the moon and how they've got these super long, the technical word would be a linear actuator, but a giant air cylinder that basically, lifts the sun up, lifts it down. The motion of the curtain tracks, the way they work with the two pulleys, one being pulled down and the other one being pulled up and down for both of them, I started thinking to myself, why could I not replace that system with a giant pneumatic cylinder, just like what's used in the sun and the moon? Maybe a little bit longer, but the same cylinder. And that's when I actually found a very large Pneumatic cylinder on eBay, and it extends 5 feet. And it was only like 180 bucks. And I was like, you know what? Why don't I buy this and experiment? And so I got it. I hooked it up to the center stage curtain just as a little test. I actually hooked it up with just a zip tie to see if it could pull the chain up and down. And it was able to pull the chain down. It had enough force. And I started thinking to myself, I may be able to replace these motors entirely with just pneumatic cylinders. And what you're gonna see in this video is I have actually fully implemented the system on Rolf's stage. It works flawlessly. And you're gonna get to see me replace it on both Billy Bob's stage and the center stage. So I'm going to try to explain as best as I can how all of this works. But basically, you have two pulleys. The pivot is the motor. And when one of the pulleys is pulled down, or I guess you could say the other one is pulled up, the curtains either extend or retract. And so you can see that there's a little guide wheel, I guess multiple wheels, that are pulled by that cable, and it either opens, depending on which pulley, it either opens or closes the curtain tracks. Now, you'll see that this is actually detached on this end, and you can see that that little shower curtain is pulled down, and that's actually because this motor almost ripped the curtain off the tracks entirely a couple days ago. So I have not set that back up because I plan to replace this, which is funny that it happened right as I was about to replace these motors. But yeah, so you can see you've got the motor, and then you've got the relay box, which has, let's go ahead and open it up. So this is the relay box, and it has 6 relays. I'm gonna be totally honest, I don't even fully understand how all this works. And this is actually part of the reason I would like to replace this with a system that I do better understand. But I'll try to explain it as best as I can. So these relays receive the signal from the gray box, which comes in through here. And these are 24 volt relays, or at least they are triggered by the 24 volts. And then these trigger relays that are higher voltage for the actual motor itself. I don't know why there's 2 sets of additional relays, because you would think, okay, the 24 volts could trigger the 110 relays, and then that would activate the motor, but apparently not. And the reason they're in sets of 2 is there is a relay for both the opening and the closing. So because there's 2 separate signals. There's a signal to open, there's a signal to close. So like, for example, if it, gets a signal to open it, activate this relay, and then it maybe activate this relay. I don't even know. I think it goes from here to here and then down to here. And then there's a timer to make sure that if they open you can't close them for a couple seconds. So I've had the relays fail. I've had mainly the starter capacitors and the motors will fail. And then I've had issues with the contacts as well, which I've had to clean multiple times. And then the chain, there's not really that much information on the tension for the chain. You know, I try to keep it relatively tense, but the chain will come off. It'll actually get stuck. I've had the chain get like stuck and bent in between the sprocket. It's a mess. And ask any showbiz tech if they had issues with the curtain motors. They will tell you they had nothing but issues. This thing can rip itself up off the floor. That's why it's got the goal of this spring is, I think, or maybe originally they had these bolted to the stage completely, but you know, if let's say the motor keeps running and it keeps pulling on the chain and it starts to pull maybe the ceiling down, you don't want that. So I think they added the spring so it'll lift itself up a little bit instead of ripping, you know, the ceiling down. But maybe it was always there. Maybe it's supposed to keep the tension of the chain or something. But I'm pretty sure it's the first thing I suggested. So anyways, I have just had so many issues with this. I'm very excited to get rid of this whole system. You know, goodbye relay box, goodbye motor. I'll just have a long cylinder that probably starts by here and goes down here, and there'll be a valve. And, you know, one of the nice things about the relay box is you do have like a manual opening and closing, but with the valve, I will also have that. So, you know, one of the buttons on the valve will open it, and one of the buttons on the valve will close it. So, you know, I'll still have the manual override that this has, but, you know, all this will be gone. It'll be a much more simple system, and I am very excited to replace this. I hate doing 0.5s, but for the purposes of this, just to show you. So you can see, make sure I don't get these tangled up. So as I pull down on this side of the pulley, the curtain opens, and then pull down on this side, and the curtain closes. So you can imagine you had a giant cylinder and it's gonna pull down. You know, imagine you have a cylinder attached here and it pulls down, and then you have a pulley on the floor. Also, just for credit's sake, I do want to mention that my friend Kanan is the one who came up with the idea to do a pulley on the floor. I had my own idea using 2 pulleys, but his was much better. Where it pivots, you can easily use a cylinder. And that's exactly what I did with Rolf's stage, and that's what I'm going to do to this stage as well. So this is a demonstration of the cylinders I'll be using for the curtain tracks. This is called a rodless air cylinder, and the principle it works by is the same as a typical air cylinder, but a shuttle is being moved instead of a rod. I'll include a link in the description for a more in-depth video. Here is me operating one on the floor, but obviously once I get this up on stage, it'll be vertical. Now I have the cylinder on the stage, and I'm going to start taking measurements. So here I am putting the wood into place, and that's what the cylinder will bolt to. Now I'm going to take the chain off of the pulleys. Here I am just attaching the pulley to the shuttle of the air cylinder. I'll replace the hardware later. Now I'm putting the pulley in place on the floor and bolting it down. There I'm putting an eye bolt on, and this is where the cable attached to the other pulley will be connected. Now I'm routing the cable around the pulley and attaching it to the other pulley. Now the two pulleys move opposite one another because they're connected. Time to put the air fittings on and install the valve. For initial testing, I did not organize the air hoses or use elbows, but these were added later. Now you can see it's hooked up to air. Let's give it a go. You can see just how quickly the curtains can move when the flow controls are open all the way. Now it's time for center stage. This is the exact same process I used for Billy Bob's stage. So now that we have it attached on this end, we can slip this underneath the pulley. And now, I may have to change the position of the pulley a little bit so that it doesn't run into the cylinder, but we'll just tie this on here for now so that you can see. You can now see. All right, so at least for testing purposes, this is ready to operate. I'm going to hook up the valve to it, and then we'll see how everything works. And then there's a couple pieces of hardware that need to be replaced. These, I need to get a smaller, and I want to have 2 of them. 2 wire cable clamps for each of the cables so that it's redundant, so there's no chance that it loosens. And yeah, and then there's a couple, need to replace this bolt with something better. But other than that, we're going to start with testing. All right, so now we're going to move on to the electronic side of the project, and we are able to use the same signals from the gray box without modification. But unfortunately, the signals themselves that the gray box sends, they are not powerful enough to activate a solenoid valve, so I'll have to use a relay for each of the 2 signals. Right now, I'm creating a little box that'll house the 2 relays, and it'll have a port that the cable from the gray box comes in through. It'll have a port where the actual wires from the valve come in, and then at the very bottom, the 24-volt power supply will plug in. All right, so these are the boxes that I bought. I ordered smaller boxes, but I got these boxes. They're relatively large, or at least larger than what I need. But I think that's going to end up working out in my favor because I'll have more space to work with, although I am only putting 2 relays in here. So the 24-volt power will come in through the bottom, and then through the left hole, the cable that goes to the gray box will come in, and then on the right, that will be the wires for the solenoids that will come in. Basically, as stated previously, the relays will be triggered by the gray box, but the power they're switching comes from a separate 24-volt power supply, which will attach to the port at the bottom. All right, so here I have the box installed, and it's hard to get a camera in here, so I'm not going to film me hooking up the valves, but as I was pointing to you guys, these are where the black wires go for valve 1, valve 2, and then the red positives, they connect into this Molex connector. So those wires will be routed in there, and then they will connect into the box. And as you can see, it's hooked up to the gray box cable, and everything should work. And then obviously 24 volts comes in through the bottom, so that will plug in there. So if we grab this and plug this in, we now have 24 volts. And then I'll do some wire management and get all this looking nice. I've also got some elbows that I'll be installing here. But yeah. Now I'll do the first test triggering it with a gray box signal. I created an identical box for the other 2 stages, and it was installed the same way. Now let's take a look at how everything turned out. So as you can see, we have all of the curtain cylinders now working, and I'm going to take you, this is almost finalized. I would say 99% done. Might be a couple very small adjustments I may make, but you can see I've replaced the hardware with the proper hardware. You can see the pulley is bolted right here, and then I've got this eye hook right here that's attached to through this pulley to the other one, and you can see I have two of these I guess wire clamps on each of these just for redundancy to make sure nothing comes loose. You can see we've got a flow control here, flow control down there. We have the control box, the two relays inside of here. This is the cable that comes from the gray box. This is the solenoid valve. And this is a double solenoid valve for switching for each of those signals. And yeah, so you can see just how nice that looks. This has been a really exciting project for me. I'm very happy with how it turned out. We'll go over to the center stage. You'll see essentially the same thing. I'm just going to leave it here just so that you can see it. So you can see it go. All right, so one thing that I didn't mention that I think is pretty important too is these are 68-inch stroke cylinders. This travels 68 inches, and that is just enough to open the center stage. Maybe it's in reality 70, maybe it's 67. Whatever it is, it's very close to 68, and so that's what I'm using for actually all three stages. But what I did, because obviously the side stages do not open as much as the center stage, the track lengths are different, is the cylinders actually have these adjustable stoppers. And so instead of having the stopper at the end right here of the 68 inches, it is up here. It's at about, let's say, 48 inches. And so because the side stages only travel about 48 inches as opposed to the center stage, which is 68. And one kind of small issue in the ideal world, I wouldn't want this, but because there's about 20 inches of unused section of the cylinder, there's a slight delay in terms of the closing of the curtains, maybe a half second, which I know might bother some people, but for me, I can't even notice it. So, but it is something I would mention. In an ideal world for the side stages, you would need to get about 50, maybe 48 inch stroke cylinders for the side stages, and then for the center stage, 68 to 70 inches, in that range somewhere. I wouldn't go any smaller. But I just wanted to mention that because, and the reason there's a delay, because originally I was like, why would there be a delay? Well, you got to think there's 20 inches of cylinder, high volume cylinder, that have to get filled up by air before that. Before this, you can actually watch it here. So I'm gonna hit the button on the cylinder or on the valve, and then we're gonna see there's a delay because that whole section of the cylinder has to pressurize. So versus on this side, it's virtually instantaneous. So just a small little thing that I learned through this, but it doesn't bother me that much. All right, so in terms of the cost of this project, the cylinders cost about $600 a piece. I got them on eBay brand new. So total, the cylinders were $1,800, the valves about $100, flow controls $50, electronics $250, power supplies $20, air hose $60, fittings $100, mufflers $100, pulleys about $50,
cables about $10, and then the bolts and kind of various pieces I had to get were about $20. So the total was $2,560, and I probably spent a bit more because there were a few test ideas that didn't work out, a few components that I tested that didn't work. So I probably spent a little bit more than $3,000. But if you're wanting to do this retrofit, obviously you don't have to go through the trials that I went through. So expect it to be around probably $2,000 to $3,000. And I also want to mention that I did get fairly lucky with the cost of the air cylinders. The particular type of air cylinders that I'm using from Pneumatic that I bought on eBay for $600 a piece. If you order those directly from Pneumatic, they are $3,800 a piece. And again, I got them for $600. These probably are the highest end Pneumatic cylinders you can get. And, you do not have to use them. There's no reason to use them. They're overkill. The ones in the sun and the moon are much less expensive, and I would recommend going that route. It just so happened that these were available and they were cheap on eBay. And there are also other brands that make this type of air cylinder like SMC, and I found some of their cylinders that sell for as low as like $300 that are, 68-inch stroke. But the type of air cylinder I did use, those pop up on eBay all the time, and they are not selling for what Pneumatic sells them for. And then obviously this cost doesn't factor in my time, but I would say that at least for me, it was definitely worth doing because I've just had so many issues with the curtain motors previously.
Here we come, walking down the street, we get the funniest look.